Hello, and welcome to the Center for Fostering Success Best Practice, Best Fit webinar series. I am Carrie Ward, Program Coordinator for Fostering Success Michigan at the Center for Fostering Success at Western Michigan University. Before we get started, I want to say a special thank you to our funders, the Kresge Foundation, the Havermill Foundation, and Western Michigan University for helping us with all of our work. And then also I wanted to mention some housekeeping. So all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you want to ask questions or chat with us, please just use the chat or questions feature on the control panel to your right. If you have technical difficulties, you can contact Citrix at 1-888-259-8414. Sometimes we do have some sound troubles, and so I'm going to try to navigate that throughout, but hopefully everything will work. A recording will be available following the webinar, and it can be found at www.fosteringsuccessmichigan.com in our resource library or on our YouTube channel. So today I want to say welcome to Nathanael Okpych. This is his second webinar that he's done for us. Hi, Nate.
Hello.
And before we get started, I'm just gonna go ahead and read your bio, and then I'll turn it right over to you. Nathanael Okpych is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. He also serves as project director for the California Youth Transitions to Adult Study, CalYOUTH, a 5-year study under the direction of Dr. Courtney that evaluates the impact of extended foster care on youth outcomes. Dr. Okpych studies the transition to adulthood for foster care youth. His research focuses on post-secondary education outcomes, social support networks, mental health, and independent living services. Thank you so much for being with us today. I understand that there's a big snowstorm in your area, right?
That's right, yeah.
Well, stay warm, and I'm just going to turn it right over to you.
All right, great, thank you. Hopefully, everyone who's listening, you're in a place that's a little bit less snowy, maybe not warmer, but at least a little bit less snowy than where I am. So again, thank you for inviting me on this webinar series. It's really a fantastic webinar series, and I'm so excited to be a part of it and to share some of my recent research. So what I'm going to be talking about today, really the main question is looking at how, for foster youth, how past trauma may have impacted their perceptions of relationships and their openness to relationships, and then in turn, how their perceptions and openness to relationships may affect their likelihood of getting through college, succeeding in college. So this work comes from my dissertation. I finished my dissertation earlier this year, and this is a little slice of it. And before we get started diving into the study, what I'm going to do is I'll give a little bit of a background. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but this really just helps to set the stage. So the data that I have here it comes from the Midwest study, which is a study that was conducted by Dr. Courtney, followed about 700 foster youth from 3 Midwestern states over the course of about 10 years. And what we see here is, let's say we'll start with about 100 foster youth who are 17 years old. When we ask them at age 17, how far do you want to go in terms of your education, about 84 out of 100 say that they want to go to college. However, when we follow them about 10 years later, a little bit less than 10 years later, at age 25, 26, we see that only about 40 out of the 100 actually made it into college. And then the most dramatic drop that we see is of those 100 foster youth, we see that only about 8 have earned a college degree, either a 3-year degree or 4-year degree, by the time they're 25 or 26. So we take these 8% of foster youth. How does that compare to the youth in the general population? And what we see is that around the same age, from a very large study called the Adulthood Study, about 46% of young people had finished college by around the same age. So there's a pretty stark disparity. Foster youth are about 1/6 as likely to have finished college and earned a degree compared to youth in the general population. So this leads to the question, what are the barriers that may stand in the way that foster youth may face that prevent them from finishing college? A lot of this comes from research, mostly qualitative studies, but some quantitative studies. These barriers are ones that you're probably well familiar with, so I'll just go through them pretty quickly. Academic preparedness is a huge barrier. This comes both from the fact that foster youth are more likely to have attended secondary schools and primary schools that either were lower quality, weren't as rigorous. Foster youth also experience a lot of disruptions in their placement changes. And we see that when foster youth enter college, they're more likely than other college students to need to take remedial courses. And there's been some research out there that shows, at least the way that remediation is currently delivered, being enrolled in these classes might actually hinder students from continuing on in college. Many foster youth also are in a precarious financial situation. One paycheck away from having to drop out of school and work. Social capital is another issue. So this is in terms of having people that are skillful and available to navigating college, the technical aspects, academic support, emotional support when things are become difficult. Many foster youth have other life demands that they have to grapple with, such as taking care of children, working a job. We also know that mental health and substance use issues are also a problem for some foster youth. And one of the important things, though within the past 20 years, there's been some pretty important changes in the laws and services that are available for foster youth. A lot of these services actually phase out right when foster youth are in the middle of their college. So, for example, if states are in a state that extended the age limit to 21, overnight pretty much you have foster youth that age out of foster care and now they don't have a place to live. Other supports too that also phase out while youth are in college. One barrier, though, that I think I lost control of slides. All right, are you able to advance the slides on your end?
Sure, hold on just a second. There you go.
All right, okay. So there's also some less visible barriers. So what's going to be the focus of today's talk is the lasting impact of past relational trauma on foster youth, and which can impede their ability to seek help and use help even when it's available. And this is really important because all of the barriers that are listed above, really what has to happen before that is, in many cases, foster youth have to go out and reach out to other people, form relationships, and trust other people in order to get help with academic issues, financial issues, and so forth. However, if you have youth that are reluctant to seek help and use help, then these other things could become much more severe barriers. All right, there we go. So we're going to talk about adult attachment styles. There have been several qualitative studies that have been conducted interviewing foster youth. These are foster youth that are still in care, some that have exited care. And one of the themes that comes out is this idea of foster youth adopting a self-protective stance in response to traumas that they've experienced in their relationships. So there's countless stories of foster youth having a really close relationship with the caseworker and the caseworker leaving. Foster youth changing placements almost overnight, and very, very suddenly, abruptly, they have to adjust to a whole new school, whole new neighborhood, new house, or setting that they're living in. And so what all this says is it's understandable that many of these foster youth will take on a guarded stance, an emotionally guarded stance to new relationships. It's adaptive, something which is self-protective, and what these studies suggest in terms of development psychology concepts is this is what's displayed as an avoidant attachment style, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All right, so just as a little bit of background, we won't go into this in too much detail. Attachment theory really focuses on early childhood, and the idea is that the repeated interactions that a child has with their caregivers forms a durable pattern of expectations that children have about relationships, the emotions that they experience in relationships, and then the behavior patterns that they form. And what research has shown is that these attachment styles are generally stable over time. However, the attachment styles can be influenced by experiences later in life. So, for example, McEwen talks about how these attachment styles can be altered by powerful experiences that affect a person's belief about the value of help from attachment figures and the feasibility of attaining safety, protection, and comfort. So some of these things that I described before and that were captured in qualitative studies about relational trauma about foster youth losing important people pretty suddenly, about maltreatment, which is really a violation of basic trust in relationships. These are some experiences that foster youth can experience later in life that can affect their attachment style. And what we see in terms of attachment style in adulthood, typically the way that it's measured is it's measured on two dimensions. First dimension is an anxious dimension. And this really is about concerns that relationships with others will be severed. So these are adults that tend to be clingy, needy, and just do a lot of behaviors that are just anticipation that relationships will end. Second dimension is the avoidant dimension. And this really is about a preoccupation about maintaining distance from others, right? So this is kind of a strong emotional guardedness, closed off to others, to relationships. So it's more of a self-protection. And the way that it's typically measured is that if an individual is low on both dimensions, they're said to have a secure attachment style. If adults are high on either one of the two dimensions, then this is an insecure attachment style. And as I mentioned before, many of these qualitative studies really are picking up on where I think foster youth having an avoidant attachment style. And again, this is something that's adaptive based on the loss and the trauma that they've experienced in past relationships. So a little bit more about avoidant attachment. It's really characterized by, one is by a tendency to avoid emotional closeness. So not expressing emotions, being emotionally guarded, not letting others in to what you're feeling, especially when feelings involve difficulties that you're having and emotional pain. Another characteristic is just minimizing dependence on others by being highly self-reliant. And we see this in some research. Gina Samuels calls this survivalist self-reliance, where foster youth take a pride in having gone through and endured the hardships they experienced, and really being proud that they're the directors of their own life, that they can accomplish. They really don't need other people. So also a tendency to downplay threats and to also to suppress acknowledging personal faults. And what both of these are doing is really protecting the individual's ego, right? Their sense of well-being and their pride. That when there are threats that come into play, or their personal faults that they have, then by not acknowledging them or by downplaying them, this protects the sense that I'm a capable person on my own that can get through problems on my own. All right, so just to connect the dots about how I think all this comes into play in terms of college persistence for foster youth. So as I mentioned before, many foster youth enter college in a somewhat precarious situation, and really connections to adults that are resourceful and peers at their college. It's going to be something that could make or break their college success. It's really going to be instrumental to the college success. However, if some foster youth, those that have experienced a lot of maltreatment and a lot of relational instability, they come into college with very emotionally guarded, and I can do it on my own view of relationships. This could compromise the amount of social support that youth have available. So just to map it out, right? Foster youth are going to vary in terms of how the extent of their maltreatment and the types of maltreatment, how much they've experienced. They're also going to vary in how much they moved around in foster care and how much loss they experience. But those that experience an excessive amount of relational trauma, these are the youth who are going to be higher in avoidant attachment. Then when they get into college, youth who are higher in avoidant attachment, I expect that both their social networks are going to be smaller, so they're going to develop relationships with fewer people that they could turn to for support. But even among those relationships that they do have, the available support, these foster youth are going to be less likely to turn to others who are available to help them. And what that's going to happen, having fewer people to turn to and being less likely to turn to resourceful individuals, it's going to make them more likely to drop out when problems arise, right? When they're having trouble academically, when there's something going on emotionally, when they're about to lose their housing or some other struggle. These are going to be youth who are high in avoidant attachment are going to be the youth that are going to, their MO is to try to do it on their own and get through it on their own. And it's something which ultimately I think is going to hurt them. So that brings us to the current study. It's really three questions that we're going to look at today. So one, does past relational trauma, right, and I measure this by school changes, foster care placement changes, does that predict higher levels of avoidant attachment? Second question is, among the youth who made it to college, are youth who are higher in avoidant attachment less likely to persist in college, right, make it through the first year? Are they less likely to ultimately graduate? And really the third question is, if we do see this relationship that avoidant attachment decreases the chances of college success, is this relationship explained by the amount of social support that youth have around the time that they're in college? So talk a little bit about the data that I've drawn. So this is a quantitative analysis. I drawn data from Dr. Mark Courtney's Midwest study. This is a longitudinal study of foster youth from 2002 to 2011. During that time, there were 5 interview waves that were conducted with the youth. They were about 2 years apart. The initial sample included 732 youth who are interviewed at age 17 or age 18. And these are youth who were in foster care for at least 6 months in one of 3 Midwestern states. And most of the data that I'm going to be drawing from in terms of the avoidant attachment and other things, they come from the Midwest study. For the college outcomes, what I did was I linked youth who were in the Midwest study to college records from the National Student Clearinghouse. This was done in 2015. And because there are some issues with National Student Clearinghouse data that I won't get into, which basically risk of not identifying youth who really went to college, I cross-checked youth self-reports in the Midwest study about whether or not they went to college and whether they finished college. So that helps to fill in some of the problems with the National Student Clearinghouse data. So we have data on the foster youth about age 29 or 30. We'll see if they finished college or not. So for this analysis, I have 2 samples. First sample has to do with college persistence, and this includes 331 youth who we have data in the National Student Clearinghouse for. We need data from the National Student Clearinghouse to measure persistence, because NSC data gives you semester by semester picture of whether or not youth were enrolled. The Midwest study, we didn't capture data that specifically. Then in terms of when we're looking at the analysis for degree completion, whether or not youth earned a 2-year degree or 4-year degree, I included just 329 youth who could be observed for 6 years. There were some youth who first enrolled in college later on, and it doesn't make sense to ask whether or not foster youth earned a degree if they were just enrolled for a year in college, for example. So they weren't included in that analysis. All right, so in terms of the analyses, most of the variables, including avoidant attachment and other control variables, they were measured at age 17. And this was used to predict the college outcomes later on that came from the National Student Clearinghouse data. Controlled for a wide range of factors, demographic factors, a bunch of factors about youth education history, behavior problems, mental health and substance use problems, maltreatment and foster care history, and also how selective the colleges that they entered into. Also looked at the mediator with social support. This is what could explain the relationship between avoidant attachment and the outcomes. And this was assessed at all 5 ways of the Midwest study. And what I did was I used a social support measure that was closest to around the time when the youth entered college. As I mentioned before, the outcomes for college persistence. This is whether or not a youth made it through their first 3 consecutive semesters. So they made it through the first year, and they made it through first semester of their second year. And then the second variable is whether or not they earned a college degree. It could be a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. I used binary logistic regression. This helps to control for some things that could explain the relationship between avoidant attachment and the college outcomes. And I used multiple imputation, which is a sophisticated statistical procedure that helps to fill in some of the missing data. All right, so quickly talk about the avoidant attachment measure that I used. It comes from the experiences in close relationships scale. The original scale had 36 items, including 18 items for avoidant attachment. Some modifications had to be made in the Midwest study just for time constraints. So only 11 out of the 18 items were asked during the Midwest study. And originally the ECR is used to talk about specifically romantic relationships. The questions were modified to talk about relationships in general, not just romantic relationships. So for the avoidant attachment measure, we have 11 items. It was measured at age 17 or 18. List a couple of example questions that, a couple of the 11 example questions. So for example, I prefer not to show others how I feel deep down. I find it difficult to allow myself to depend on others, right? These tap into some of the dimensions of avoidant attachment I mentioned before. And youth can answer these questions on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being strongly disagree, 7 being strongly agree. And Cronbach's alpha for this measure is 0.77, which means that these 11 items held together pretty well as a measure of avoidant attachment. All right, so we'll turn to the findings. In the persistent sample, we see that just about 1 in 3 youth made it through their first 3 semesters in college. For degree completion, these are among the youth that we can measure for, observe for 6 years or more. We see that 24% had earned a college degree. Now, remember, these include just the youth who made it to college. This is not all foster youth. All right, so in terms of avoidant attachment, we see that, remember, the scale is from 1 to 7 when we summed all the 11 items together. The average for foster youth is about 3.6, and this is, using real data, this is about as close to normal distribution as you can get. So we're in pretty good shape in terms of running some analyses. So this looks at the relationship between past maltreatment and avoidant attachment. I won't go into the details here about all the measures of physical abuse and neglect, but just from a standardized measure called the Lifetime Experiences Questionnaire. And what we see here is that starting at physical abuse, youth who said they experienced no physical abuse are on the first column. As we go from left to right, we see that the more physical abuse foster youth experience, the higher is their avoidant attachment. This is kind of what we would expect. Similar pattern for neglect. The more instances of neglect that a youth reported experiencing in the past, the higher their avoidant attachment was. Sexual abuse. Youth who reported ever being sexually abused or molested, they had a slightly higher avoidant attachment score than did youth who were not sexually abused. All these relationships are statistically significant. So at least from this first pass, it suggests that past maltreatment is associated with higher avoidant attachment. This next slide looks at relational instability. So on the left, we have a scale for the number of school changes, and what we see, similar pattern, the more school changes that a youth experienced, especially if they experienced 5 or more changes, the higher their avoidant attachment score was, right? The more emotionally guarded, the less likely they are to rely on others for support. Similar thing on the right-hand side, the more foster care placements that a youth experienced, the higher their avoidant attachment was. So this really gets at the first research question: is past maltreatment and relational instability associated with more avoidant attachment? And the answer that we see so far is yes, it is. All right, so we're going to get into the results of the regression analyses, and I show just the really abbreviated results. On the bottom, you see a long list of control variables that were also included in these models. I don't list them here just because your eyes would probably spin. And really because we're interested in the relationship between avoidant attachment and the college outcomes. So you'll see that in the middle pane, these are the outcomes for persistence. On the right pane, these are the outcomes for degree completion. And what I did was express these outcomes in terms of odds ratios. So the way an odds ratio works is 1.0. If there was an odds ratio of 1.0, that means that there's no relationship between avoidant attachment and the likelihood of persisting, right? Your level of avoidant attachment doesn't influence persistence. If you see an odds ratio below 1, going towards 0, then that means that the higher the avoidant attachment, the less likely it is that a youth will persist. So in this first comment bubble, this is the formal interpretation of how to interpret the odds ratio. So for each 1 point increase in avoidant attachment, the expected odds of persistence drops by about 29%. All right, this is more of a layman's interpretation. So what this is saying is that youth who are higher in avoidant attachment are less likely to persist than youth who are lower in avoidant attachment. We see that in persistence, right? This is a model that didn't control for anything. we see that the odds of persistence drops to about 29%. And then when we turn to a model that controls for a wide range of factors, we see that the relationship got a little bit weaker. It's kind of on the margins of statistical significance, but it's still a pretty robust relationship. Youth who are higher in avoidant attachment, less likely to persist. When we turn to degree completion, we see that youth who, it's a very similar pattern. Youth who are higher in avoidant attachment, less likely to earn a degree in college. That's both in the model with no controls and then in the model with control for differences by demographic factors, educational history factors, and a wide number of other things. Relationship actually gets a little bit stronger. Now, these last 2 points, these get to the third question about whether social support is explaining the relationship between avoidant attachment and outcomes. And persistence is the statistical, if you see the p-value drops a little bit, that means that there's a little bit, it's explaining it a little bit, but not that much. But really for the 2-year and 4-year degree completion, we see that the coefficient is no longer statistically significant, which means that it suggests that youth who are higher in avoidant attachment have less likely of completing the degree. And part of the reason that's explaining it is because these youth have less social support than youth who are lower in avoidant attachment. All right, so just to kind of put this into, convert it into some numbers that make a little bit easier to interpret. Let's say we take a sample of youth, and let's say that these youth, the probability of persisting through the first 3 semesters is 33%, right? And let's say these youth were average in terms of their avoidant attachment. Now, if we were to compare these youth to a second group of youth that were the same in terms of all the characteristics that that were controlled for in the regression model, the only difference is that these youth are 1 point higher in avoidant attachment. Their probability of persisting drops to 27%, right? So moving on 1 point of the avoidant attachment scale drops the probability of persisting by about 6%. And that's similar to what we see in terms of the probability of completing a degree in college. All right, so to wrap things up, what we saw is that youth who experienced more maltreatment and relational instability, they had higher levels of avoidant attachment at age 17 and 18. This is not surprising. There's been other studies in the past that, not on foster youth, but in the general population, that show that maltreatment in the past does increase avoidant attachment and other attachment insecurities. The interesting part of this study, though, is that it's kind of the main question of the study is what we saw is that youth who are higher in avoidant attachment, this actually hurt their chances of persisting in college and ultimately earning a degree. And this finding was robust after controlling for a wide range of other factors that may explain this relationship. And one thing which I didn't present here for time's sake, but I also looked at anxious attachment, whether or not anxious attachment, we saw a similar trend. Had some reasons to expect that it would not have this relationship. And what wound up happening was that youth who are higher in anxious attachment did not affect their likelihood of persisting or earning a degree. We can talk more about that in the discussion if there's interest in that. And then finally, to get to the third question, we saw that the amount of social support that youth have is partially to explain the relationship between avoidant attachment and the college outcome, right? So youth who are higher in avoidant attachment have less social support, and this hurts their chances of persisting in college and ultimately earning a degree. All right, so a few quick limitations. One is about the attachment style itself. I mentioned that the Midwest study omitted some items due to time's sake, so it would have been ideal to have the full scale of 18 items. Also, the attachment style was measured at age 17 or 18, which for some youth was several years before they entered college. So ideally, it would be great to have a measure of a youth attachment style right before they enter college. In terms of the social support measure, the social support that was measured in the Midwest study is a pretty broad measure, and it's really about youth perceptions about whether support is available. It's not about if they actually received support. And it really didn't capture the mechanism that we expect to happen. So if youth who are higher in avoidant attachment are less likely to turn to others when problems arise. That's really what we would ideally want to measure, but that wasn't available in the Midwest study. So hopefully for a future study, we'll be able to look at that. And then one final limitation is that it's always a question of whether the findings that were found in this study, which is a particular geographic region and that particular period in time, will this generalize to other times and other regions. Two implications. One is that there are many factors that influence whether or not a foster youth goes to college. The findings from this study suggest that attachment style might be one of those factors that are really important in influencing college outcomes. And this is critical, as I mentioned before, because if youth run into difficulties, but their MO is to try to do it on their own, not to turn to others for support, this could undermine their best efforts to finish college, right? So another implication is that we may need to address some attachment issues as part of intervening with foster youth. One component would be to treat the underlying trauma that's kind of keeping youth frozen in terms of their views of relationships and their willingness to open up. Normalizing help seeking is another important one, and then providing opportunities for them to develop connections with adults and with peers. And I can talk more about these in a discussion section. Then in terms of research, we really need to get more detailed information on the social networks and the social support that foster youth have in college, and to see if there are differences in their social networks and social support that vary by their attachment style. All right, so I want to quickly thank Doris Duke Fellowship, and then the fellowship that was offered by National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation. These are two fellowships that supported my dissertation work, and I want to thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
So thank you so much for sharing your information with us, Nate. It's such an important topic because I feel like we hear a lot from campus coaches and professionals and supportive adults about how students often with experience in foster care kind of like to do things on their own and don't like to ask for help. And I think asking for help anyway is difficult for so many of us. Mm-hmm. But I think that your study really gives name and evidence to what a lot of people are experiencing in the field. So thank you for sharing that. I would ask everyone out there, if you have questions for Nate, please feel free to use the questions feature or the chat feature, and we'll be looking for your questions and sharing them live. We do have a question. So is there any research on how foster youth compare to other youth in terms of avoidant attachment?
All right, this is a good question. So ideally, what we would have had is a comparison sample to the Midwest study youth that asked about avoidant attachment in a similar way. We don't have that. There have been other studies that have been conducted, mostly with the adults that measure their avoidant attachment. In one large community sample that had, I think, about 80,000 adults, they broke down the avoidant attachment score by age range. And the age range that most closely matches the Midwest study participant is the age range from 18 to 22. You might recall that the average avoidant attachment score for Midwest study youth was 3.6. This is significantly higher than the average avoidant attachment scale for 18 to 20-year-olds in a general community sample. That was about 2.9. So 3.6 versus 2.9 doesn't seem like a big difference, but it's on a 7-point scale, so that's a pretty considerable difference.
Absolutely. Another question, did all youth in the study have issues with avoidant attachment? If it wasn't all of the youth, how many had these issues?
So this is another good question. So the measure that was used for this study, the experiences in close relationship scale, the authors of this measure, creators of this measure, really emphasize that there is no really hard cutoff point. So unlike some other scales, for example, depression, if you reach above a certain score, you're considered with a screening of depression. Below it, you're not. The authors emphasize really to not use that, but instead use this as more of a continuous variable to get more of the variability in what's happening. Having said that, though, we can take a look at the Midwest study youth and map them onto the large community sample that I just mentioned. And if we do that, if we could, one thing that can shed some insight is how many foster youth in the Midwest study were above the average avoidant attachment scale for the youth in the general population. And what we see is about 74% of Midwest study youth scored above the average in terms of avoidant attachment. We can also, if you wanted to look at it a little bit, a little bit more, kind of look at the extreme cases of avoidant attachment. If we went up one standard deviation higher in avoidant attachment, so these in a general community sample, this is about 10%, 12% of the youth, right? What we see is that about 30% of Midwest study participants really scored a very high range, at least one standard deviation above the average in terms of avoidant attachment. So again, foster youth are overrepresented. They have higher avoidant attachment scales compared to young people in this community sample study.
Another question, for foster youth that are resistant to asking for help and who are closed off kind of emotionally, is this something that can change? And what are some things that might help them to drop their guard?
Yeah. So this is a $1 million question. It's a question that I've thought about a lot, both based on my own practice experience from talking to others. And I still don't have a definite answer. I think youth are foster youth are gonna vary in terms of their openness. But what we do know is that it's a fairly durable trait, and it makes sense because a lot of these youth have undergone a lot in their lives, and they're protecting themselves from future trauma. That's really kind of what this is about. So I think in terms of what we could possibly do, one thing that I think is critical is that the trauma has to be addressed. Right? If you try to do something without addressing the trauma, it's going to be really difficult. Because the trauma is what is keeping these youth kind of locked into being closed off emotionally and being resistant to or reluctant to use help. Another thing which I mentioned before was normalizing help seeking. So I think a lot of youth at this age when they're first entering college, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, they want to do it on their own. There's a strong sense of independence. And a lot of young people that go into college, they're going to run into difficulties in different aspects of college. It's tough. It's a really difficult transition. And so I think, in beginning orientation with foster youth, making that message really clear that, look, college is tough. Everyone struggles. It's normal. It's not, a sign that you're inadequate or you can't do it on your own. This is actually something which is a strength, right? If you're able to go and to turn to others for support, this is going to be something that's going to help your own efforts out. Being able to just normalize help seeking, that's another thing that could be done. Then a third thing, I think one thing that's one of the strengths in the campus support programs is they allow foster youth to develop relationships, both with staff. These are oftentimes staff that are really committed, and they invest a lot of time and energy into foster youth. But more importantly, relationships between foster youth are able to be formed. A lot of foster youth are understandably reluctant to form relationships with adults because a lot of adults have let them down, disappointed them, have left them. So being able to have an opportunity to form relationships with peers that have gone through maybe a similar experience that they have had, this could be something which could be a really important intervention because the youth can learn to drop their guard and allow each other to help each other and maybe encourage each other to give other adults who are responsible to help them out.
We have another question. This is from Kathleen. Is Dr. Okpych aware of programs that support developing the relationship between high schools and colleges for those students who are at most risk of dropping out?
Yeah, so this is another good question. There are a number of programs around the nation. One of them is called First Star. I believe there are about 10, 12 programs across the U.S. We have a program here at University of Connecticut. And really what this program does is it identifies young people in foster care who are in high school, and it tries to basically get them ready and equip them for college, to get them focused about creating college plans, takes them on college visits, has relationships with colleges that are nearby. I know there are many other programs like that in the nation, some that are specific to foster youth, and then others that are more general, such as Upward Bound, that are geared more generally to underrepresented college students, which foster youth definitely fall into. But it's a really good question because this is on a different research topic. But one of the I think one of the great things about extended foster care is that it gives foster youth the opportunity to get into college, but not necessarily form lasting connections at the college that could help them see their way through all the way through college once extended care expires. And having these bridge programs early on that does an intentional job of forming relationships between foster youth and people at the college can help make college a little bit less anonymous and have people that they can turn to in college when they're struggling.
Could you you cut out just a little bit when you were saying the name of the program? Could you repeat that?
Sure. So one of the programs is called First Star for Youth.
Okay. Okay, because
I'm sorry, it's just First Star, not First Star for Youth.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm mixing programs up.
That's okay. So many programs, right? But it's great because they're very
That's a
supportive.
good thing, yeah.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit about anxious attachment related to college persistence and completion?
Sure. So this was for when I was thinking about this study. The anxious attachment was more of a kind of a competing hypothesis. So my thinking was that youth who are high in anxious attachment, this may not be something that negatively affects their persistence. Because really, you think about what anxious attachment is. These are young people who are, in a way, that's kind of like on the opposite end of the spectrum. These are youth who are concerned that relationships are going to end, but instead of pushing people away, being emotionally guarded, and trying to do things on their own, these are students who would be, maybe overly needy, right? If a problem happens, it blows up to a catastrophe that everyone needs to come in and rescue, and all hands need to be on deck. So my thinking is that these are youth when they're in college and they encounter a problem, then they would go to the other extreme where they would kind of reach out to anyone and everyone for help. And maybe at first you'd find some people that would help them, but once individuals started to realize that this is a bit excessive, then that might be a little bit deleterious down the road. But my thinking was that avoidant attachment youth who really just try to do it on their own, they'd rather kind of go down in a sinking ship under their own control rather than ask for a lifeboat. That's going to be what would really impact persistence. Not so much the youth who are kind of reaching out, very feverishly for support when something goes awry.
That makes sense. Okay, that looks like all the questions that we have. I want to say thank you so much again, Nate, for sharing your expertise with the FSM network. You're always just a great guest, and I feel for you with the snowstorm in March. Terrible. But hopefully we'll get some more of those nice 60-degree days as we're
all right.
coming.
Thank you very much again for having me on this presentation. And if there's any questions that come up, feel free to email me at the email address that's listed. The findings from this presentation haven't been published yet. I'm hoping that will change very soon. And if you're interested in receiving a copy of the publication, if and when it does get published, I'd be happy to share that as well.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for attending the Center for Fostering Success Best Practice, Best Fit webinar series. If you have any questions about upcoming webinars or you'd like to access a recording of today's webinar, please visit our website. If you also have a research study that you're interested in presenting via the series, please contact me. There's my email address. And if you like this content and would like to see it continue, please donate today at www.fosteringsuccessmichigan.com. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.